Perceval, the Holy Knight of the Dove, wielder of the Holy Lance, and one of the 3 Grail Knights. But what about the Perceval of Fate Grand Order? How well does he compare to his mythical counterpart, and what grade would I give his depiction? Let's get into it. Perceval is a Lancer class servant, which does fit him quite nicely. Perceval is regularly depicted wielding a spear, and often a specific one, the Lance of Longinus. Since this is going to come up again and again throughout this video, I'll just get this out of the way now. The Lance of Longinus is a spear that is said to have stabbed Jesus while he was on the cross. It is considered to be a holy relic in Christianity, though curiously there are quite a few holy lances out there. One was in Jerusalem and brought to Constantinople, another was found in Antioch during the First Crusade, another ended up in Austria, Poland, Armenia. You get the picture. Who knows where the true one is? Anyway, this lance has been linked to Perceval in various legends going all the way back to the 12th century, and so it makes sense that he would wield it here. There is also the fact that Perceval's Welsh name, Peredur, itself can mean something like hard spear, so certainly his parents had already picked out his future weapon of choice. In other words, Lancer fits Perceval quite nicely. Moving into his character design, Perceval certainly looks the part of a knight, being tall, well-built, and heavily armored. As you move up his ascension forms, that armor only gets heavier. His left shoulder in particular is quite large. Apparently, that's actually his shield that he bolted onto his armor so that he could wield the lance with both hands. I'd wonder if that would be a bit too awkward or heavy, but Perceval is meant to be pretty awesome, so maybe he's gotten used to it. His armor is white, which stands in contrast to the black armor of Galahad, the other Grail Knight we get in FGO. Sadly, we still don't have boars. Still, white is often meant to represent purity, and so it does make sense for Perceval to go with that color scheme. Also, as we will get into later with characterization, Perceval's personality is less that of an otherworldly being completely cut off from humanity, but rather of someone who is lacking in life experiences. This is certainly not the only depiction of Perceval in white, though in the older stories he actually gets red or vermilion colored armor. Honestly, there really isn't much else for me to say about Perceval's design other than to say that it's fine, acceptable, competent, decent. Okay, I'll just say it's good. At the very least, I don't really have anything to complain about. Getting into his skill set, Perceval's first skill is Protection of the Holy Grail, which gives Arts Card and MP strength buffs for 3 turns to all allies, while also charging his own MP. This one is a no-brainer. Like Galahad, Perceval is one of the 3 Grail Knights, and actually is the original one since Galahad came later on. More on this later. In any case, Perceval's connection to the Grail is solid, and so there really isn't anything more to say. Perceval's second skill is Guardian Knight Sacred Lance, a taunt skill that focuses enemy attacks against him for 3 turns, while also increasing his own MP gain when taking damage for those 3 turns. This is a variation of the skill Guardian Knight, which is meant to represent the defensive power wielded by one who protects others, with its power increasing as more people put their faith in this defender. There is only one other servant in FGO so far with this skill, Georgios, St. George. Since Perceval wields the Holy Lance and has a pretty good reputation as a protector and looking out for others, this too is a good skill for him. Lastly, Perceval's third skill is Light of Salvation, which grants invincibility for a turn as well as some healing to an ally of his choosing. This is actually meant to just be another effect of Perceval's MP, but which has ended up becoming a separate skill. Basically, the Holy Lance gives additional healing and protection to allies, but conveniently we can use this without needing a full MP gauge. While part of me wants to call this lazy, I'll go ahead and give this a pass because of how much of a big deal is made of this lance. And relating to that, Perceval's noble phantasm is Longinus Count 0, whereupon he hops up onto his horse, charges towards the enemy to ride them down, and then heals an ally afterwards. This MP applies Ignore Invincibility and increased MP strength for a turn before damage, the MP buff depending upon overcharge, then hits all enemies before giving a heal to the ally with the lowest percentage of their health remaining. Now, I've already talked about this lance and its connection to Perceval, so there isn't much need for me to rehash it here. It certainly makes for a good choice for his MP, since it serves as his main weapon in many versions of his legend. Also, the spear being able to not only harm, but also heal comes directly from Wagner's take on Perceval's story. Lastly, this is actually meant to be an anti-fortress MP, so this lance is packing some serious power here. There are even some comparisons made between this lance and weapons like Excalibur and Rhongomyniad. Now, I'd call this a more special lance than Rhongomyniad. See my King Arthur video for more info on that. But comparing it to Excalibur, I'd say Excalibur is cooler than this. I might be a bit biased on this though. Anyway, moving on. Perceval's craft essence is Holy Lance Longinus, which, okay, seriously, enough with this damn lance already. Honestly, the only thing I can really add to this is that in the description, Percival says a bit about how a knight shouldn't wield a weapon like this, but that circumstances are dire enough that he is being summoned with it. This might just be his humility talking, but basically things are so bad that Percival automatically gets summoned with a crazy powerful weapon. But considering that we have been summoning deities for a while now, a knight wielding a sacred lance doesn't seem too crazy anymore. Percival's Valentine CE is Beautiful Yet Short-Lived Flower, featuring a flower in the middle of a field. Now, while we do get that great scene about how Percival wishes to meet with Melusine, since this is proper history Percival rather than the Lostbelt Percival Melusine knows, there is actually more going on here. This flower is actually a reference to a part of Wagner's opera Parsifal, where Percival journeys into a garden full of maidens who try to get his attention. Percival manages to resist, and so the maidens leave him alone with a new arrival, Kundry, who tells Percival of his parents and tries to seduce him, though that fails. Now while this does work as a Valentine CE, honestly, this might be the most story-relevant Valentine CE I've seen thus far. It's certainly better than his Bond CE just being the lance where he already has a skill and MP dedicated to it. Perhaps whoever was in charge of making Percival's Valentine CE decided to make up for that. From my perspective, they certainly did. And now for characterization, starting with a brief summary of Percival's part in Arthurian legend. Well, I say Arthurian legend, but the truth is the Percival we get in FGO actually draws from several different sources, with many being just about Percival rather than Camelot as a whole. The earliest appearance of Percival can be found in the 12th century story Perceval, the Story of the Grail, written by a French author named Chrétien de Troyes. Not only does this story establish the character of Percival that we have come to know, this is actually the very first story in Arthurian legend where the Grail comes up. It's not even holy yet either. In other words, Percival is the hero of Arthurian stories that involve the Holy Grail, until a much less interesting character showed up to take his spot. Anyway, Percival actually grows up with his mother in the wilderness far from civilization. Not because he was born there, but because his mother quite deliberately wanted to keep Percival from following in the footsteps of his father and brother. Later versions of Arthurian legend state that Percival's father is King Pellinore, one of the kings who opposed King Arthur's ascendancy to the throne after drawing Caliburn. It was actually during a duel with King Pellinore that Caliburn shattered, leading to Arthur having to need to go get Excalibur. Also King Pellinore was the one who killed King Lot of Orkney, the husband of Morgause, and father to Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth. Indeed, Gawain and Gaheris would be the ones who killed King Pellinore in revenge. The Orkney brothers, those four along with their half-brother Mordred, would also kill Sir Lamorak, King Pellinore's son and Percival's older brother. In other words, Percival's mother decided to take the young Percival off into the wilderness to try to keep him from getting murderized by the good chivalrous knights of Camelot. But of course, Percival would one day see some knights riding through the forest where he lived, and immediately decided that he wanted to be just like them, deciding to set off for Camelot despite his mother's pleas. Percival would prove to be an interesting addition to Camelot, because while he lacked much worldly knowledge due to having grown up away from civilization, his sense of right and wrong was quite solid. This may not be a perfect comparison, but Percival kinda reminds me of Goku, as a character who seems ignorant of the world due to growing up outside of it, but who is able to manage well due to being a person with a good heart. But I might just be thinking of Goku due to recent events. Anyway, Percival quickly proves to be a quite capable fighter, but he ends up following his mentor's advice a bit too closely. Since his mentor told him not to ask too many questions about what he encounters, Percival ended up not saying anything when he first caught sight of both the Grail and the Holy Lance, which soon led to people getting angry with Percival for doing exactly what he was told to do. Percival, chastened, then decides to go after the Grail in earnest, but it is here that this first story about Percival ends. The reason for this is that the author seems to have been afflicted by a sudden case of death, and so was not able to finish it. It would end up being a German poet, Wolfram von Eschenbach, who would take this French story about Percival, expand upon it, and give it a proper ending. Percival, or Parzival, undertakes a journey where he learns more of the world, of spirituality, the significance of the Grail, and ultimately becomes the new keeper of the Grail. He also, in contrast with many of his later versions, gets married and even has children. Later interpretations of the Grail quest put great emphasis on Galahad and Percival being virgins, and those being key reasons why they are able to attain the Grail while others like Gawain and Lancelot are not. Now, while Percival is actually meant to be Welsh, since his first complete story about him is German, Percival's story tends to have stronger Germanic roots than other parts of Arthurian legend, which tend to be more Welsh or French. But then, to the detriment of everyone, Galahad shows up and basically steals Percival's spot in the Grail quest. While Percival is present in later versions of Arthurian legend, his significance is lessened considerably. In Mallory, Percival enters the story roughly around halfway through, during the latter half of Tristan's adventures. He plays a minor role by getting involved in other people's stories, such as rescuing Tristan from King Mark, or finding and bringing Lancelot back to Camelot after he'd lost his mind for a few years. But then we get the Grail quest, and Percival is brought to the fore. He wanders around searching for Galahad for a time, is almost seduced by a temptress who turns out to be Lucifer in disguise, meets up with Bors, before ultimately finding Galahad and bearing witness to the completion of the Grail quest. After Galahad ascended to heaven, Percival would become a monk for just over a year before he too passed on, leaving it to Bors to return to Camelot and tell the stories of Galahad and Percival. There is, however, one other story that influences Percival's depiction in Fate Grand Order, and that is the opera Parsifal by Richard Wagner. Yes, that Wagner, the one whose music plays during the helicopter scene in Apocalypse Now, but whose racial views would attract some unpleasant fans. This would actually be his last opera, releasing less than a year before Wagner's death in 1883. Anyway, it is here in Wagner's opera that we get several elements that become part of Percival's FGO character. His association with doves, being the wielder of the Holy Lance, and the character of Kundry, the one who tries to tempt him, fails to do so, but in the end ends up having the curse afflicting her lifted by Percival. While this version is based upon the older French and German tales about Percival I mentioned before, significant changes have been made. Overall, from these three different versions of his story, the original French and German, the one found in Mallory's version of Arthurian legend, and the Wagner opera, we get the character of Percival in Fate Grand Order. When it comes to Percival's characterization in FGO, though, we have a bit of a problem. On the one hand, Percival gets an extensive amount of screen time during Lostbelt 6, Avalon Le Fay. But this is Lostbelt Percival, and explicitly not the Percival that is summoned as a servant. There are some connections between them, such as both wielding a special spear or Lostbelt Percival's horse being named Kundry, but that's about it. But there is one potential narrative link, though not quite as strong as the one we saw between Babanchi and Tristan. Melusine is not Kundry. She acts more as Percival's older sister rather than as a temptress trying to have a curse lifted. But, in a way, you could say that Melusine is cursed, her abusive relationship with Aurora that keeps her miserable. Percival seeing her in the rain is the starting point for him working towards trying to free Melusine from that situation, though he thinks it is Morgan rather than Aurora who is causing Melusine such pain. It is his personal reason for creating the Round Table Army, with the eventual goal of overthrowing Morgan so that Melusine could live freely. Alas, things are more complicated than that, and while Melusine is ultimately freed from the curse of her relationship with Aurora, with Percival's spear playing a key role, it is hardly what you can call a happy ending. Aside from this narrative similarity, Proper History and Lostbelt Percival are two characters who share the same name, fight the same way, and have fairly similar personalities, but are otherwise two distinct characters. Unfortunately, this means that, in a video where I have to assess the accuracy of Proper History Percival's depiction in Fate Grand Order, this cuts away the overwhelming majority of Percival's screen time, since the time we have gotten with his summoned Proper History self has been quite limited in comparison. Percival is noted as being one of the knights who refused to side with the Lion King in the Camelot Singularity, but that's only the briefest of moments. His only event appearance so far for us NA players has been in the Christmas 2023 event. During this event and throughout his voice lines in My Room, he regularly wonders whether or not everyone is having enough food. But as you might expect, this interest in food and making sure people eat enough doesn't come up in the legends about Percival. It's something the FGO developers added to him. Despite this, it's not completely out of nowhere. Percival did look out for and rescue other Round Table knights on a few occasions, notably Tristan and Lancelot. So having Percival also be the sort of person interested in making sure that the Round Table knights also eat enough food is at least similar to that. It paints Percival as someone who is always trying to take care of others and look out for his allies. While this might be a new addition to the character, it is at least consistent with Percival's established personality. As for what we will get in the future, I haven't heard of anything major involving Percival, certainly nothing like his Lostbelt 6 appearance. Well, there is a new light novel series, Fate Lost Einherjar, that has Percival in it, but it remains to be seen what role he will play there. As for FGO, in a few months Percival will get an interlude that reenacts part of his story from the Wagner opera. But aside from that, there is just way too little to go on for Proper History Percival. So when it comes to figuring out the accuracy of his characterization, the only thing I really have left is a nitpick. Part of Percival's profile in-game mentions his reaction to hearing about the death of Gareth, with Percival mourning alone in the Camelot Gardens. The problem is, of course, that Percival died before Gareth did, and so this scene never would have taken place. This is only one small detail, though, and it doesn't change the core problem Percival has in FGO. Percival in the British Lostbelt was an amazing character, but since he can't be summoned to Chaldea, we instead get his proper history character. The thing is, we've had so little time with the proper history Percival that, until this is fixed, his character is massively overshadowed by his Lostbelt counterpart. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Percival's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, his character design and skill set certainly have clear links to the character from different myths and stories about Percival, even if I may poke fun at how often that Holy Lance comes up. There is enough here to give Percival his own distinct identity separate from the other Round Table Knights. Characterization, though, this is much more troublesome because his biggest role in the story thus far is basically a different character entirely. Lostbelt Percival is a great character with some narrative similarities to his proper history counterpart, but because he is not actually the Percival you get as a servant, the proper history Percival we summon has far less development in comparison. We only really get scraps to piece together in order to determine how well portrayed he is. The result is that Percival just feels hard to deal with for a video like this, because so much of his screen time is not actually relevant for assessing his accuracy. Based upon what we do get, proper history Percival seems to be a mix of elements from his legends, some new additions that are still in character, and an accuracy flaw in his backstory. Percival's depiction is not bad enough to damn him, but it's also not good enough to get real praise either. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Percival, the Holy Knight of the Dove, a C. If you would like to learn more about the character that took Percival's starring role in the Grail Quest, check out my video on Galahad here. Until next time.